morning. Welcome to Ashland. My name is Eric Brooks. I'm the curator here at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate. And welcome to Wake Up with Ashland. It's good to be with you again this morning. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Lexington, and it's a great day to be live with Ashland. I want to take a minute to thank Dupree Mutual Funds for their continued support of this series. It's been great to bring you all of the things we've brought you over the last, getting on 5 or 6 months now. And very pleased to be able to continue to do that. So thank you to them. Thank you all for tuning in. And we appreciate you being with us, being able to share our collection and some of the important stories in our collection. Good morning, Gaynell Warren. Good morning, Mary, one of our volunteers. Good morning, Wood, a Henry Clay descendant. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate having you. You all are very loyal watchers, and we're really glad to see you every morning when we do our Wake Up with Ashland. So today, good morning, Carrie. Thanks for joining us. Today we are looking at an interesting subject, Native American heritage at Ashland. Andrew, hello Sue, Andrew, another of our volunteers. November is Native American Heritage Month, and I thought it would be interesting. We have some very interesting artifacts. It's really fascinating stories in our collection, many of which rarely get looked at. In fact, I've got some things on the table that I'm going to show you today that until I started preparing for this, Tuesday afternoon, I guess, I had never really looked at with any serious consideration. I knew they were there. I knew generally what the story was, but had never looked thoroughly into it. And I've discovered some interesting things. So it's a good start. Maybe this will spur some further research on our collection. Good morning, Claudio. So before we begin looking at the Clay family and the Native American pieces in our collection, I think it's important to make a special note. And I thank Cameron for pulling this info together. There's actually a website where you can go to look this up for any location in the United States. But it will allow you to look at the Native American peoples that lived in a particular location over time. And it's important to understand that Ashland and Lexington and Kentucky were all occupied by native peoples up until, the mid to late 18th century. And it's important that we recognize those peoples, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Osage, the Yuchi, the Adena, the Hopewell. These peoples all lived here and all had an impact on the land. In fact, it is not a place that is widely known. Good morning, Dwayne. But in Fayette County, in the very northern part of the county, there is actually an Adena mound. It is a round mound, a circular mound, ring-shaped. It's actually owned by the University of Kentucky. They open it for special days. It is not open all the time in an effort to preserve it. But it's a fascinating place, and it's a reminder that it was a sacred place and that there was actually a village near that location. Now, I am not aware of much of the prehistory of Ashland, whether there were Native Americans that lived on this property. There is a spring nearby that Henry Clay used, and I suspect Native peoples at the very least camped near it or used it from time to time, may have lived near it. Sources of water were often places where people gathered, so it may have been the case. We've never done a lot of archaeological work in that area. What we've done has been aimed at looking at the historical archaeology of the site, the archaeology of the Clay family. Nonetheless, we know that native peoples were here in this area and probably did pass through this property at one time. So a very important thing to remember. So I'm going to start today with an artifact, and there are several, particularly the first couple, that I have shown before. But I'm going to use them in a little different context today. This first artifact is one that says a lot about the nature of the relationship between native peoples and white people in the early 19th century. So this item we showed recently in our campaign memorabilia. This is John Quincy Adams' inaugural medal. So each president has a medal cast when they are inaugurated. This is the one that was done for John Quincy Adams, 1825. If we flip it over, you can see here, it's got two figures. It says, "Science gives peace and America plenty." And you can see here, there are two figures. The science is represented by this sort of Grecian-looking figure, a European figure. America is represented by this native figure sitting on a cornucopia. This is really interesting, I think. What it's basically saying is that white people, knowledge, science, culture, give peace. Native people give bounty. They are associated with nature, with wilderness. There's a concept called the noble savage. And this concept basically refers to the idea of native peoples being sort of wild, noble people that lived in the woods, that were part of nature, etc. So it's establishing this idea that white people are going to create peace through their superior technology, superior knowledge, etc. And this is the way that white people felt about native people, that they could bring peace because they had culture, which is an unfortunate view. And it motivated a lot of the expansion of the country, the movement of native peoples, an attempt to assimilate them and divest them of their culture. Good morning, Zach. Good morning, Shannon. Good morning, Debbie. This was going on in Clay's time, and it was an issue he had to deal with as a legislator. Certainly by the 1830s, we had acquired large tracts of land in the Louisiana Purchase, etc. We're expanding westward, and that brings us into contact with a number of native peoples, not least of whom was the Cherokee. And this beadwork belonged to Henry Clay. I'm trying to get back here a little from it. It is Cherokee beadwork. We've determined that through research and consultation with native curators at other museums like the Idle Jorg in Indianapolis, Indiana, and with the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and other institutions of that sort. It's a spectacular set of pieces, by far and away the most spectacular native pieces in our collection. And these, remarkably, were found in a bag under the eaves where they had been stored and to some extent forgotten about. So it's taken a lot of research for us to determine what they were. This little card was written by Henry Clay's great-granddaughter. And you can see here that she indicates these were given to Henry Clay by Indians, by the Cherokee. And another reason we believe that these are Cherokee has to do with a speech, several speeches actually, that Henry Clay made in support that he offered to the Cherokee. Now, they are being forced west in violation of many treaties. Henry Clay believed very firmly that as a nation, we had an honor and a duty to live up to the treaties we negotiated, and that only through renegotiation, lawful renegotiation of those treaties, could we make changes and affect relocation, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that he believed in the equality of the races or anything of that sort. In fact, Clay made statements to the effect that he thought eventually native culture would just disappear, that white culture would essentially eliminate it, and that really wouldn't be a great loss. And that's a very sad statement and shows a lack of understanding of native culture and the importance of it. But nonetheless, the native peoples, Cherokee particularly, appreciated the fact that he at least was willing to fight for their rights under the treaties that had been signed by the United States. This is from Niles Weekly Register. You can see here, this is a popular publication of the early 19th century, kind of a weekly news magazine, if you will. And it's got this speech of Henry Clay where he talks about the treaties that we had entered into with the Cherokee and how those treaties, what those treaties said and what we needed to do to live up to them. So this helps reinforce the notion that this is Cherokee beadwork. And you can see the incredible artistry done here with this beadwork. Glass beadwork of this sort is post-contact work. These beads were acquired often through trade with white settlers. Prior to this sort of work was done using porcupine quills that had been dyed various colors. Good morning, Barbara. Good morning, Eldon. Thank you for joining us. Spectacular stuff. There is actually another belt, just like this one, in a museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, that I discovered I don't want to say by accident. I was doing a targeted research, but still in all, quite unexpectedly. I found it doing a Google book search for information on this material, and it turned up in a catalog. Turns out they still have it. And it came to that museum through a series of hands that began with Henry Clay's son Thomas, so we can be sure it was Henry Clay's. Moving on and moving forward in time, this is one of my favorite pieces, and this is one that we don't display a lot. It's in rather fragile condition. You can see it's a model boat. It has a number of figures in it. These figures are of two sorts. You'll see that this figure has either a hat or hair or something on its head. This one doesn't. Look at these two. This one doesn't have any hair. Good morning, Suzanne. Good morning, Jane. Over in Kennewick, across the road. Nice to have neighbors. This one's got the hair on its head. So that's interesting and important. That tells us something very important about these figures. So where did this boat come from? Well, you can see here, it's got this plaque that says Lady Franklin Bay Arctic Expedition. This boat comes from the Arctic. It actually comes either from the very easternmost edge of Canada or perhaps from the westernmost edge of Greenland. It was made by the Inuit. They are the native people that live in that region, sometimes referred to as Eskimos. The term Eskimo is a general term that covers native peoples from Greenland all the way across Canada to the western portion of Siberia. So it's a collective term that refers to a number of peoples, of which the Inuit are one. Some of those peoples regard it as a derogatory term. One of the etymological interpretations of it is that it means eaters of raw meat. There are other etymological interpretations that are not such as that, and not every person referred to by that term regards it in that form. But Inuit is the proper term for the people residing where this piece was made. So how did it get here? Well, it happens that Henry Clay's grandson, Harry Independence Clay, went on an Arctic expedition that intended to go to Lady Franklin Bay. Now, unfortunately, through a variety of circumstances, he did not make it that far and ended up not staying. But he acquired this while he was there and brought it back with him. And it passed through his family and was eventually donated to us. Harry spent a year in Greenland across the Arctic winter, and over that time got to know a number of the native peoples, wrote a great deal about their history, their interaction with European Greenlanders, and the history of Greenland. He wrote a great deal about their culture, their ways of life, and even compiled dictionaries of their language, translating their language both into English and into Latin. It's quite impressive. All of those documents can be found at the University of Kentucky. They are in the James B. Clay family papers. You can access information about that online at UK, going to their Explore UK Special Collections Research Portal. And it's a fascinating collection of work. Really amazing stuff to read. I've been through it a lot of times. It's actually one of my favorite stories. And I won't do the whole story today, but suffice to say, he brought this back because of his interest in the peoples that he met. And it's because of his work that we understand what this boat is and what these people are. So one of the things he tells us in his work is that within the Inuit culture, you can tell the people apart, male and female, by looking at their hair. Now, obviously, they're wearing parkas and heavy clothing because it's in the Arctic and it's very cold. So it can be difficult to determine at a distance whether a person is male or female. But women wear top knots. That's a top knot. So that is a female, as is that one. These two are guys. No top knot. So that's how we know that. But he also talks in his notes about this type of boat. Good morning, Camelia. Good morning, Charles. Thanks for joining us. This is called an umiak. And the umiak is a family vessel. It's what women paddle to move the family around in the Arctic. It is regarded as a women's boat, unlike the kayak, which is a hunting vessel used by men who go out hunting. It's usually a one-person vessel, but it's very similar in nature, wooden frame, skin covering that frame, and used, like I say, to move people around, move families around in the Arctic. So it's fascinating that we have this information from Harry Independence Clay. And it's interesting to note that the biggest reason that he didn't stay in the Arctic is that he became disgruntled with the physician for the expedition, a man named Dr. Octave Pavy. Dr. Pavi had some very racist views about the Inuit and didn't care for the Inuit. And he had the opportunity to treat an Inuit boy who had become very sick. Unfortunately, he refused generally to do so and took very little interest in the case because he was Inuit. He didn't feel that he was worth the trouble. That offended Harry a great deal. Harry offered to get medicine. Pavi didn't want to hear about it. And I think eventually the boy died. And that really, really inflamed Harry. And eventually it came to a point that it was a choice between Harry and Dr. Pavi, and the expedition had to have a doctor. So he agreed to leave because of that. But I think it says something about Harry that he was willing to do that. And when Harry got home, and home for him was Louisville, he did a number of talks in Louisville about the Inuit and his time in the Arctic. So he's teaching the local people, the people of Louisville, about the Inuit who are very far away and about whom they probably would have had little opportunity to learn in other circumstances. So I think it's great that he's bringing that information back and using things like this boat to educate Louisvillians about it. We also have a couple of pieces. These are actually on loan, but these came back with Harry. These are a little hard to see. I'm sure I can turn them. You see the holes. You may be familiar with a thing called an ocarina, which is South American. It's a type of flute. That's what these are. These are made of clay or stone. They're in the shape of seals, which is a common animal in the Arctic. And they have little holes. And apparently the Inuit, particularly the children, would play these. And he brought a couple back with him when he came. Now, one of Harry's brothers was a man named Thomas Jacob Clay. Thomas Jacob Clay started out life as a doctor, and he wasn't getting where he thought he wanted to go with that. So he left medicine and entered the military. And after a number of years in the military, became a marksman and so on. He is eventually sent west to participate in an action that was part of a larger group of actions generally referred to as the Indian Wars. After the Civil War, the United States is united as a nation and begins to look westward. We've acquired large tracts of territory as a result of the Mexican War. Much of that is, at this point, still somewhat unexplored. There are lots of Native Americans in the West. And so there begins a movement to move those peoples to places like Oklahoma and free up that territory for white expansion. And there are a series of military actions, things like the Battle of Little Bighorn, that are designed to eliminate Native Americans from places white Americans want to go. So he's sent west on a particular mission. He is part of a unit looking for this man. This man is Geronimo. Geronimo was an Apache leader. He was not a chief. He was friends with the son of an Apache chief, a man named Nichus, his best friend, but he himself was not a chief. He led a small group of warriors who were fighting for their land and their way of life. They engaged in a long-running guerrilla war with the United States military. The Apache reside along the Mexican border with the United States in what is today southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona, a very rugged, remote, somewhat difficult terrain. And they were a semi-nomadic people, so they followed herds, they followed seasons, but that's where they lived. And he and his people knew the territory very well, so it enabled them to live there for a long time, engaging in this warfare successfully because simply white people didn't know the land and weren't able to use it or operate there as effectively. But white people began to see him as a threat because of his actions. You have to understand that Geronimo saw members of his family killed by white soldiers, and that motivated him in his actions. But it came to a point that the decision was made to bring him down one way or another, either to get him to surrender, or if he wouldn't surrender, to keep after him until eventually they killed him. So Thomas was sent on an expedition to locate this man. Thomas and others hoped to convince him to surrender. And eventually they tracked him down. And he was part of that. He was there when the negotiations took place. He actually protected Geronimo after Geronimo surrendered. There were other soldiers, who felt that it would be better simply to kill him rather than to let him come into U.S. custody and remain in custody, that he deserved that fate, but he protected Geronimo. So he also escorted Geronimo and Geronimo's people to Texas, where they were put on trains and taken to Fort Pickens, Florida. Fort Pickens is in Pensacola Bay. They were held at Fort Pickens for a period of time before eventually being sent back through Alabama on to Oklahoma to Fort Sill, where Geronimo spent the remainder of his life. And it should be noted that Geronimo, after capture, remained a prisoner of war for the entirety of the remainder of his life, which is over 2 decades, I believe, or about 2 decades. Geronimo showed great appreciation to Thomas for the things that he did, and actually gave Thomas a bridle in appreciation for the efforts that Thomas made in protecting him and treating him with honor and respect. That bridle hung in an honored place in his family's home, a home called Balgowan, which was on Versailles Road, essentially where Calumet Farm is now. It actually was part of what is now Calumet. Later, once in the custody of the United States military, Geronimo and his friend Nicias wrote a letter to Thomas, which is in the Library of Congress, and in that letter requested his assistance in being released from being prisoners of war. And apparently Thomas did, in fact, speak to some sort of military commission about that, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. Later on, Thomas wrote up his experiences. You can see here some unwritten incidents of the Geronimo campaign, and he talks about how the surrender went and some of the things that happened. This is a book that is written by a group of veterans of the Indian Wars. They would meet like once a year and present papers. And Thomas did that after he retired, so we have this account that he writes, which is really quite a fascinating account. And Thomas would have received this medal. This is a medal received by veterans of the Indian Wars for their service. When a service person is engaged in a particular conflict, they get a ribbon and a medal for having been in that conflict. So this one is Indian Wars. Vietnam, for example, is yellow with 3 red stripes. So you can tell service by looking at that. This is a modern version. This is not Thomas's. I don't know whatever happened to his. This is an interesting piece. This actually came back with Thomas. These are Apache children that he met. These are White Mountain Apache. There are several bands of the Apache tribe, and that's who these people are. So he took this picture out west and wrote on the back some of their names. So we can see Kulo, Penal, looks like Skitty, Zeta. So these are people he met, and it's fascinating that we have this record from this important time in American history. Now, most of the rest of the stuff we have is what I would call tourist art. The McDowells, both Major McDowell, that's Major McDowell right there, and his wife Anne, and their daughter Nanette and her husband Thomas Stapleton Bullock traveled in the West. And they did that for multiple reasons. Major McDowell and others in the family suffered from tuberculosis, so they went for treatment. Thomas Stapleton Bullock was a doctor. He worked at several clinics out west. So they would go out and visit. They also went, Major McDowell went, because he hunted. And so, for example, those antlers. We have 3 sets of antlers in the collection, at least 2 of which probably came from out west. There's Major McDowell's gun over there as well. But they picked up Native American art while they were there. This pottery is all from New Mexico. There are several Pueblos that manufacture this. The Pueblo people live in adobe structures, large adobe buildings, and after settling in those structures probably 500 to 600 years ago, took up pottery and make some very, very fantastic pottery art. The white, and I'm not sure about some of this. I've only started doing research on this. So, but this is what I found so far. That this white stuff with the black designs may be from a Pueblo called Cochiti, which is known for black and white art of this sort in a variety of exotic forms, like this boot. It's a pretty cool piece. Some of the people of the Pueblo wear shoes kind of like that. This is what may be a duck. I've seen this described in other sources as a duck. So possibly, but I think this is cochiti. Like I say, I have not verified that. It is not marked. But this is all stuff the McDowells brought back. And you can see here, this is a place that they stayed, Las Vegas Springs. And it talks about this area as being a good place to come for treatment of tuberculosis. Good morning, Jimmy. Good morning, Jason. Good morning, Susan. Another Pueblo that they appear to have visited is called Santa Clara, which is on the northern border of New Mexico near Colorado. It's a very, very old Pueblo. Was given status by the Spanish Royal Crown over 500 years ago. So they had sort of an independent status. And in fact, in 1854, after the Mexican War and that territory was being brought into the United States, the Pueblo apparently presented paperwork, which has since disappeared, showing this concession by the Spanish Crown, which was recognized by the United States. So it's been a recognized federal native people, recognized federal native land since that time, and continues to be. This piece of pottery is actually marked Santa Clara. You can kind of see that there. And they are known both for this redware, but also, in some ways, more for black pottery. A very beautiful, shiny black. So this appears to have come from Santa Clara. This normally resides over there in that bookcase. I took it out so that we could see it today. These baskets came back with the McDowells and or the Bullocks. And again, I've not identified every basket. There's still plenty of research here to be done. These things we occasionally put out. We have a couple up here. There's one. There's another one. We usually keep 2 baskets here in the billiard room, and we rotate those each year with a variety that we have. But we have this publication about Pomo Indian baskets. The Pomo are a people of Northern California, Napa Valley, that area. And they are well known for making baskets. And so it is thought that many of these baskets probably are, in fact, Pomo. And we have 2 that information in this book somewhat identifies. We have this one. You can see the design work here. Kind of a bottom that's different color than the rest. This appears to be a design called Bushi Mi'a, or deer neck. It resembles the angle between a deer's shoulder and neck. So that's what this is. This piece is also quite probably Pomo and maybe Kacha or arrow points. Now, I don't know about some of these others, but there are some very beautiful designs. This one is one of my favorites. This one is really in spectacular condition, and you can see the design extremely well. That's another very attractive one. You can see there. So we have some very beautiful baskets. But all of this material was brought back by the McDowells principally to show their taste and the fact that they had the means, that they were wealthy enough to travel out west and to buy this stuff. So it's a way to show off to the people that come to Ashland how wealthy they are. So they're buying native art for this purpose. It also happens to be that at the time a lot of this is being purchased, the exotic is seen as highly desirable in homes like Ashland. There was a movement called the aesthetic movement, and this certainly would have been considered exotic or unique. So this would have been part of what they showed off to people who came to visit. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff. And still today, for example, you can go to New Mexico and buy pottery like this at the Pueblos. See my ring? You can't really see my ring too well. I'll bring it up there. That came from New Mexico. My parents brought that back for me. So that's another piece of New Mexico artwork. Are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer questions if we have any. Well, if there are no questions, then I thank you for tuning in. I kind of have to get this all cleaned up because I have to do a tour at 10 o'clock, so I don't have a lot of time to get all this put back away. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week with another episode of Wake Up with Ashland.